Big 12 has probably played its way out of the college football playoff race with Oklahoma State's loss against Oklahoma. So the Cowboys had a bit of a path as a one-loss team, but obviously they have dropped back into the pack after losing big in Norman. So now it's a jumbled mess with a lot of two-loss teams. But to make it clear to everyone, the winner of this game controls its own destiny, and Oklahoma controls its own destiny. So if they win out, then we're seeing a Texas-Oklahoma / Iowa State-Oklahoma matchup in the Big 12 championship game.
Mm-hmm. I think nobody would have any complaints about those two because both Oklahoma, Iowa State, and Texas, Oklahoma were phenomenal games earlier this season. Now the Sooners are a problem right now for the rest of the Big 12. They started 0-2 in conference play, and they've won 6 straight, and they look better week by week. Spencer Rattler's starting to get more comfortable. Their defense is looking great. They went up 21-0 on Oklahoma State in an instant, and that's a really good Cowboys defense. So Oklahoma is that team in the Big 12 that nobody wants to face right now, but this Texas-Iowa State game is going to be telling of the Big 12 race a lot. And I think that the team that can win this game, I know Texas still has Kansas State and Iowa State still has West Virginia, but the winner of this game probably will get into the Big 12 championship, I'd say.
Yeah, so Texas still has a Kansas State date, but still, you mentioned this before we started to record in regards to the season Breece Hall's having. He basically has not had a bad game. He's throwing up 100 to 150 against everybody, but Texas's run defense has been pretty stout.
Yes, Breece Hall. I don't know why. I mean, this is a really up-in-the-air Heisman Trophy season. If you want to throw one running back in that race, that's Breece Hall, and he's just done phenomenal with Iowa State. It's not like he's putting up a 250-yard game against Kansas and then 50 yards against Oklahoma State. No, he has been steady all season long. He has not had a single game this year with under 100 yards, and he's averaged 5 yards a carry or more in every single game this year, except for that Baylor game where Iowa State had that comeback. He's been tremendous, but then again, Texas's run defense has been too lately. Letty Brown, he's 4th in the country in rushing, and Texas held him to under 50 yards and really stuffed him at the line of scrimmage when they played the Mountaineers in their last outing. And Chuba Hubbard led the country in rushing last year. Hasn't had as good of a season, but when he played Texas, he was nowhere close to that 2019 status that he was at, and Texas held him to 72 yards on 25 carries. So Texas's run defense has taken some of the best running backs in the country this year and just made them a little useless for opposing offenses. Now, Breece Hall, he's number 1 in the country in rushing yards. He has yet to deliver a bad performance yet, and he's done it against some good defenses like Oklahoma State and Oklahoma, who have really improved their defense this year. So I think that will be the number 1 storyline going into this game is, can Breece Hall win the battles at the line of scrimmage, or does Texas's run defense do what it did in its last 2 games against Oklahoma State and West Virginia and impose their will on the line of scrimmage?
So, Steve, if we flip to the other side of the ball, how do you match up the Iowa State defense against the Texas offense led by Sam Ehlinger, who's posting his best TD to interception ratio of his career?
Iowa State has a really good underrated defense, and they're coming off their best performance I may have ever seen from an Iowa State defense, shutting out Kansas State completely, 45-0. That was 1 week after giving a little too many points up to Baylor. But Iowa State's defense was excellent that game. They were forcing turnovers. I think they won that battle 3-0. And their defense is really stacked, I think, in the front 7. I really like their linebacker, Mike Rose. He's really good at getting into the backfield and penetrating past linemen to get those running backs in the backfield. And I'm also a big fan of Jaquan Bailey, who's their top pass rusher and has 6 sacks. So I think Iowa State's really sturdy up front and at the line of scrimmage. I think their secondary is still formidable, but I think it's a unit that Texas might be able to expose, especially when they're getting their star wide receiver, Joshua Moore, back from injury. He missed the West Virginia game. And you're also getting tight end Cade Brewer back. He would have missed the Kansas game if that was played last week. So Ehlinger now has an increased amount of weapons to attack Iowa State with. I don't think Texas is going to have much success in the running game against the Cyclones. I mean, Sam Ehlinger is still the team's leading rusher. They might be finding a feature running back now on Bijan Robinson, who was a really highly recruited freshman and had 100 yards against West Virginia. But still, in a game that's almost a Big 12 elimination game, I'd want to play to my strengths if I'm the Longhorns. And I think that's mainly Ellinger power runs and then just throwing the ball. I mean, Texas has had a lot of success with some wide receiver screens this year, and even on post routes. I mean, Ellinger hitting Jake Smith against West Virginia, that was really their one big play of the game. So I'd say air it out a little more this game if you're Texas, because Iowa State has some players in that front seven, and I think that Texas would have their most success trying to work against their cornerbacks.
Iowa State definitely funnels everything to its linebackers. As you mentioned, Mike Rose leads the team with 63 stops. Jake Hummel, another linebacker with 51, and Orion Vance with 42. So they're three top tackle leaders on defense for Iowa State come out of that linebacking core. We get Steve Helwick on the line from Hustlebelt and SB Nation's Underdog Dynasty. Join him there, covering the MAC, covering Group of Five play. We have him on here to talk Texas. That's his alma mater. He's covered the Longhorns for quite some time as well. When you look at the Big 12, it fascinates me from the standpoint of all the various possibilities. And again, off the top, we talked about everybody with 2 losses at the top, except Iowa State actually only has the 1 loss coming to Oklahoma State. When I look at the scores, if we just look at the scoring averages around the Big 12, do you think we've gotten to a place, Steve, where the Big 12 can no longer be called that conference where there's no defense played? If you line up the scores in the Big 12 and line up the scores in the other conferences and sat down any college football fan and said, let me know which one of these lists are scores from the Big 12, you wouldn't be able to tell. It doesn't seem to be a scoring fest like it used to be.
Yeah, I think that stereotype is a little gone. I think everyone likes to point to like those Baker Mayfield, Patrick Mahomes, 66-59 games. But we've been far from that this year. The Big 12 is a very defensive conference right now. You saw Oklahoma State beat Iowa State 24-21. There's a battle between 2 of the top teams there. Texas beat West Virginia 17-13. Just rattling scores off the top of my head. And Kansas State beat TCU, 21-14. So there have been, and I'm naming a lot of different teams in the Big 12 here that have had low-scoring games this year. And there's a lot of good defensive players in the Big 12. I mean, you go from Oklahoma State, who has Malcolm Rodriguez, Kobe Harvell-Peel, Texas with Joseph Asai, and then you go Iowa State. We just talked about Mike Rose and Jaquan Bailey. There's a lot of NFL prospects on these defenses, and I think that some of the offenses and quarterback play have taken a bit of a regression this season, and there's no need for the Big 12 plays no defense stereotype this year. I don't have the statistics in front of me, but I'm willing to bet that the SEC probably has a higher average score in its game this year. And that's not always no defense. I mean, sometimes it's just a tremendous offense, which is unstoppable. So, and you have to give credit where it's due. But I think the Big 12 has been fascinating this year. And then we had the Texas versus Texas Tech and Texas versus Oklahoma score. So the shootouts aren't completely done. But since we're talking about Iowa State and Texas here, I don't think a team has scored 30 points in this series since 2014. Always expect a low score when these two teams face. Last year, Iowa State won on a game-winning field goal. It was in the 20s. I think 2 years ago when it was in Austin, Texas just destroyed Iowa State's offense and won 24-10. And the year before that, I think it was 27-6. There was a 27-6 game in there. There was a 24-0 game in there where Iowa State won. So don't expect high scores in this one, especially.
You had mentioned defensive standout Jaquan Bailey, 6 sacks. Also, Will McDonald, another someone to look out for people watching Iowa State for the first time this year. He comes into the game with 6.5 sacks as well. Steve Helwick on the line talking Iowa State and Texas. The winner controls destiny to the conference championship game against probably Oklahoma, who also controls its own destiny. How do you think this one's going to play out, not just this particular game, but the Big 12 race toward those 2 spots?
I like Texas in this game. I think that the Longhorns, They've really dominated Iowa State's offense the last 2 times they played at DKR. And last time Brock Purdy was there, Texas recorded 5 sacks on him. Compared to last year in Ames, they only got 1. So pressuring Brock Purdy is a huge thing that they'll have to do this game, especially if they already have Breece Hall under control. Because Brock Purdy, he's a good quarterback. Sometimes he's inconsistent, but he can really air it out. And Iowa State has some star receivers. I don't know if Tariq Milton's healthy for this game yet, but you have Xavier Hutchinson, and there are some weapons that Iowa State has, especially at the tight end position, Charlie Kohler, who can draw some mismatches on Texas's defense. So this game is about pressuring Purdy, getting those 3, 4, 5 sacks on him, and then Texas could really control this game and make Iowa State play from behind, which the Cyclones have not been good at doing this year when you look back to their games against Louisiana and Oklahoma State. So Texas really has to assert their will from the beginning. That's another thing Texas needs to do is play from ahead. So many times this year, Texas has been forced to come back against Texas Tech and TCU and Oklahoma, and those games have not gone well for the Longhorns always. So Texas really needs to just apply the pressure from the opening and get some points on the board offensively and have those nice scripted drives that score. So I do think the Longhorns win a close one. I will say this game is decided by 1 possession. I would say something along the lines of 27-24.
Purdy comes in at 64% completion percentage, 13 TDs and 6 interceptions, 3 TDs on the ground. And you mentioned Charlie Kohler, who's been one of the better tight ends in the nation now for a few years, 25 receptions coming in and 4 scores for the Cyclones. Iowa State, Texas, Black Friday, winner controls its destiny to a Big 12 championship game berth. Catch Steve Helwick at Hustle Belt and also at Underdog Dynasty on SB Nation. Steve, we appreciate you stopping by.
Thank you. Looking forward to a fun weekend of football.